college instructor and peace officer in St. Paul, who now lives up in our part of the world. And we have Jim Rothstein, a retired New York City detective, currently the mayor of St. Martin, and they're both very opinionated gentlemen with lots of great information. So let's get right to it. Herb, you said you wanted to talk about the political power of the police. What is your impression of the political power of the police?
Well, the reason that I picked that as a topic to suggest anyway was that the Black Lives Matter movement seems to be running into a problem of lack of prosecution, lack of accountability relative to some pretty obvious, unjustifiable deaths, in my opinion. And the fact that they have some civil disturbance, I think gives some reason to expect that there'll be limited response from government in terms of police accountability. But behind the scenes, there is the issue of extreme political power by local police, not just small cities, not just big cities, but the police as a organization, brotherhood, occupation, whatever you want to call it, and that there's certainly knowledge by detectives of where that power comes from.
Is this a long-standing situation, or is it only recently that the power has grown?
I think the power of local law enforcement, certainly in my experience, and the power of state law enforcement in my experience, at least goes back 50 years.
Okay.
That's my experience begins about 50 years ago as a young person in law enforcement. And part of the reason I got out was that I figured out that it's a pretty efficient, pretty powerful group, and while I respect and admire many of the people that are in it, I didn't want to be a part of it anymore.
Yeah.
If I couldn't change it. And I thought the best way to change it was to get into teaching. And I think, at least in my former students' minds, I'm famous for being a civil libertarian that had been a police officer. There aren't too many of us.
No, I can imagine that. So you were a police instructor in your career, and that was at, where was it?
I retired out of the Law Enforcement Training Center in St. Paul.
Okay.
And began teaching at Lakewood Community College, which later changed to Century College.
Okay, got it. What do you think, Jim? Do you think the police have power?
Well, yes, but it goes back, when I went to the police academy in New York City, you gotta remember I came from this area.
Right.
And I went there and I was taught, and I never forget it, to serve and protect the citizens. And that was very fine, and I got to ride in a police car as a rookie. You'd fill in after I got out of the academy. And then I met reality, and I was told that here's one thing you remember: it is better to be tried by 12 than carried by 6.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
okay.
but then I found out at that time yet the police were actively helping people. And as you know from our conversations, I got into the prostitution business because most of the victims there were from Minnesota, and the captain decided because I was from Minnesota I should take care of the problem. And yes, it was that way, but it didn't take long. They started changing, and it became more of a fundraising unit. You were given quotas, the average cops and stuff, and it got to be more and more political, and they got more and more powerful. So I agree with her 100%, and it really has changed in the last couple of years. These police officers are forced to enforce what I call politically correct, feel-good, do-good laws to adjust social standards, and laws cannot make social standards. But now these cops are put in a predicament. You have to give out so many drunk driving tickets, you have to do this, you have to do that, and they cause confrontation. And anytime you have confrontation, you're going to have negative results. And you see in many of these things, they go in and they're taught, you go in there and just stop it. Where we were told, you go there, you talk, you see what you can do, and as a last resort, you issue a summons or make an arrest. And that's not the way it's done anymore. So I think it's time we get back to the cops serve and protect the citizens.
Instead of pushing bullets.
Yes.
I'd like to comment.
Yes, please.
In my experience, both as a police officer and as an instructor, police trainer, with lots of friends in law enforcement, I know of no instance of quotas in Minnesota. There's certainly been encouragement to do work, to make some traffic stops or whatever, but my definition of a quota is they tell you you need X number of DUI arrests. If they did that, the number would go to zero. Because it would take 2 seconds for a police officer to go to court and say, I arrested this poor sap for drunk driving because my chief told me I had to do it. And that would end the process. So we don't have quotas in Minnesota, not even close.
No,
There's hardly even encouragement to work.
Oh.
It's the other extreme in my opinion.
Well, let me ask you this. You two have had a chance to chat. You just met today. Did you get any feel for the difference between St. Paul and New York City? Because you were active at about the same time, same decades, and the way policing is done. And that's kind of a trick question, and I brought it out of nowhere, so if you can't give me an answer, I
Want
won't.
to go first?
Well, yes, there were some, because I also had the occasion as a detective to come out to Minneapolis and Minnesota in my investigations. And the big thing was we had money where they didn't, well, I saw right away that they didn't have the funds that we had to do the work that they were expected to do. But I found the cops here were excellent. I worked with some of the most trustworthy men I've ever met. And the big thing was the money. You know, if you haven't got money to do your job, especially in law enforcement, it's awful tough. Am I correct when I say that funding here was not like we had in New York?
I'm not sure about that. I would say that from my perspective, one of the things that I picked up on the differences, my opinion was that about 95 to 98% of the police officers in Minnesota are honest, decent human beings, and I didn't get that impression of New York from talking to them. And I don't doubt that out of whatever it is, 35,000 cops in New York, that there's probably 30,000 of them that are Boy Scouts, just pure as a driven snow.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a gang of 3,500 people who are willing to bend every rule to please their masters, and they want to get ahead, they will do what they have to do to get ahead, and that's a pretty large number of people. It's a whole nother program, but the obvious thing is that somehow related to Black Lives Matter, there should be civilian review, and
Yes.
obviously prosecutors who work with the police are not in a position to make good decisions. They're compromised by their friendship and working relationship.
Right.
So the whole concept, a whole different topic obviously, is
Yeah,
civilian
I agree.
review, but even when they have civilian review boards, they're not really controlled by civilians, they're controlled by police liaison officers and county attorney consultants, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I'm more proud than a lot of people would think I would be, as critical as I am, but I'm more proud of being a police officer than anything I've ever done.
Well, that I will say too. I knew who the corrupt cops were. The corrupt cops knew who the honest cops were. And I will tell you, I was proud of the men I worked with. We knew each other, we knew who we were, and we worked accordingly. And you were right with the numbers about what the percentage is. The Civilian Review Board, we ended up having one. You're right about how it's set up politically and everything else. There has to be oversight on anything. But don't just stop with the police. Have the oversight on the prosecutors and everybody else, and defense and everybody else. And let's see, as you mentioned, Colleen, and and Herb mentioned, let's get the people back involved, and let's, if the people don't do anything, and we can do it, we work for the people. And that's one thing I will tell you in New York, when the people would come up and rise up, they would get results. And I don't see that around here as much.
Maybe it's a Minnesota nice issue.
Yes.
I don't know. That brings us to the subject of human compromise. First time I heard that term was yesterday during a pre-interview with you, but you have a lot to say about that.
Well, yes.
First define it, tell us what it is.
First of all, human compromise is when you get information where somebody has violated either his marital trust, some social standard, or has gone with prostitutes, pedophiles, or whatever else. You can be compromised in many ways. And it is something that the general public has been devoid or has not been informed of because it's so rampant. How I found out about it when I started working prostitution, after the girls got to trust us, they started giving us information. And this developed into where I got an informant. She ended up being running one of the top quality prostitution rings, call girl operations. And the other part of it was I had a pedophile who was a victim who ended up becoming a perpetrator himself, who made a living off of using human compromise, first to extort people for money, and second, to extort them for power. And that's how I first found out that there was more to this prostitution business than just turning tricks. And I found that this information was very valuable, because once I knew, for instance, I needed certain people that they wouldn't mess with me when I stepped on their toes. So if I had information of some misconduct they did, well, I wouldn't be bothered. And once we got into that and started working further, we found out there were really organized efforts throughout every level of government and business and such, where they were using people to compromise other people.
They were setting them up with
Yes.
prostitutes.
No, many of them, they set themselves up, but what they didn't know is that somebody was getting the information. And I found in my law enforcement work, most criminals with fast money cohabit with these people. So, and they talk. Even the politicians talk. Well, we had one prostitute, her bedpost was hollowed out, and at appropriate times we would be recording it. So it wasn't hard for us to
Gun in
get.
her bed.
Yeah, and there was times you could be sitting in your, it was known that you hung out in certain places, and there'd be messages left. And we solved crimes. It was a great crime fighter. Besides, but the big thing was once we got to the higher levels, where, like I had told you yesterday, I had an unlimited expense account, and I had freedom of travel anywhere I had to go. So my responsibility was to go around the country and establish an intelligence base to find out how all this was really working. And the human compromise became one of the biggest issues that we had to work on. It was very confidential because we found that if we put those records in with the normal police intelligence records, as we were just talking about corruption, somebody would take them and go and extort the guy. So eventually, all this information was kept out of the mainstream police department or any files at all. And it was very valuable to this day yet. You just had a case of was he Representative Hastert, Senator or Representative? He just got nailed. Well, look at what he paid. Millions of dollars. And this is the other part of it. But now if you have, as in one case, we had politicians that were compromised and made to do things they would have never done under normal circumstances. A big incident that happened was the Watergate break-in. To this day yet, many people don't know the real reason for the Watergate break-in. There was a pedophile and a prostitution ring operating out of Democratic National Headquarters, and what they needed was what we call the book. The book is a file they used to keep of what the customer wanted, how much he spent, and everything else. So now, if you got that information, and they weren't going to steal, they were going to copy the book, can you imagine the power you would have? Because both the Democrats, Republicans, and other big people were using that call service. And why do I know that? Because I ended up arresting one of the burglars, Frank Sturgis, in New York. And after he found out who I was, because we had both been in the Bay of Pigs and stuff like that, we had a good conversation. Plus, later on, I got to meet Carl Schaffler, the detective who made the arrest of the Watergate burglars, who, by the way, had been off duty a couple of hours before he made the arrest, and he told everybody he was going on vacation because they knew if Lee was there, he would interrupt them, because Schaffler knew a month ahead of time the break-in was going to take place. We had informants in there. And so that was another one of the levels of how human compromise works. My informant, Skull Murphy, I can use his name because he's dead now, he had admirals compromised. I was just mentioning Admiral Church and Admiral Forrestal both committed suicide because he was extorting them. And it went on at that level. And as you know, just a couple of years ago, the governor of New York got bounced when he was ratted out. That was human compromise all the way. The guy that ratted him out was Roger Stone, who I knew when he was working with Cohen, who had been the Roy Cohen, who had been a lawyer in the McCarthy hearings, and his whole purpose was human compromise. So this is how that goes on.
You are a wealth of information. You mentioned that you'd like to talk a little about a victim that you're currently working with. In fact, when we were at Jim's house yesterday, he got 4 or 5 phone calls from the same person who is hoping that Jim can help her with her case. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yes, she is a military person. She was in one branch of our military, and she became the victim of continued sexual abuse, outright rape by higher-ups and everybody, and she had gone through this for a number of years and got out. So now she's trying to, how would you say, get help, because I've dealt with victims of this at every level, and this poor lady can get no help anywhere because they tell her she made all this up. And she has names, dates, times, places. And this is another thing, like I had mentioned earlier with Skull Murphy, with the 2 admirals. Now here is the biggest problem we have with this military business. If you're a private female and the captain, and you have sex, the captain is compromised. And like this lady says too, all the people that I had sex with technically are compromised because what they did was illegal.
Yeah.
And if there's guys like me out there who are watching this and have the information, you know, say I'm the enemy and I need you compromised. One of the things we heard earlier is exactly what falls into that. That's why people do things that you would never expect them to do. And this poor lady has gone to the VA. I've spoken to many of the people, counselors and stuff that have worked with her. She gets absolutely no help. And this is part, they talk about PTSD and the suicides. That's a big part of it. And this is why we've got to do something. And as I also told you yesterday, in the investigations I did here, we did 4 investigations. We were stopped at every level. The last one, the governor of the state of New York formed the New York State Select Committee on Crime. And that was when I did a lot of my work out here under the New York State Select Committee on Crime with the prostitution in this area, in the Stearns, Morrison, Crow Wing, Cass County area. In fact, we had witnesses come in and testify. But we were even stopped by the level of a governor's action. He formed the State Select Committee on Crime to look at the effects these crimes were having on society. We ended up being stopped. And it was all covered up. And that's why, when that happened, I went to, we had hired this corporation, a think tank run by Harold Laswell. And I asked Harold, I says, how come I get stopped all the time? What can I do? He says, the only way you will ever accomplish any of this if you organize the mothers. And you know, he's right, because if you can get the mothers to stand together, they can make the men and fathers do what they have to do to protect their children. And Harold said it's the only thing that will ever work. And you know, he's right, because I've used it on occasion. So that's where this, and that's the only thing that will fight human compromise too.
Human compromising and trafficking,
Yep.
war. Women have a lot more power than we ever think we have, I believe, and we're not really taking advantage of all of it. Herb, I want to ask you about your relationship as a police officer with the FBI and what the dynamic is between those two agencies.
It's an interesting question. You didn't inform me in advance, so I'll just tell you that it's a pretty limited relationship.
Okay.
My time in the police department, the whole entire time I was a patrol officer assigned to either training or to patrol on the street.
Okay.
Most of my association with FBI came as an instructor in college where I hired people to teach. And some of the people I hired were BCA agents, some were FBI agents, some were retired FBI agents. And at that point in my life, I was drinking pretty heavily, and so were they. So I learned things that I have no verification for, but I can tell you that my thoughts about the FBI have changed pretty dramatically in terms of percentages. I'd probably say they're just like the New York City Police Department or Minnesota law enforcement. You know, there's a small percentage of them, but they can do some serious damage. They have some serious mobility, some serious credentials, financial backing, etc. So if they aren't interested in protecting your civil liberties or your rights, they're not going to get protected. And if they're interested in violating them, 9 times out of 10, nobody's ever going to know it. And if they do know it, they're not going to do anything.
So you kind of frame it in terms of what they have to gain by being dishonest. You frame it in terms of what they have to lose by being honest. But it comes to the same thing. If you can't buy somebody, then you have to catch them in an act that they wouldn't want made public. So,
Let me just throw one thing in terms about compromise. I'm fairly certain that everything we knew about pedophilia in Minnesota was not just known, but actually documented. And if they would allow 100% access to all the records of the BCA, the FBI, and the St. Paul Minneapolis Police, I'd be willing to bet you that there are more pedophiles that need prosecution. And the reality is, very few have, if even a handful have been prosecuted. Most are either suspended or paid off in a civil lawsuit, where frequently they say, none of the details of this information can be released is a condition of your accepting $50,000 or whatever for this transgression. And that all that information is just the tip of the iceberg of what all levels of law enforcement know. And just another big subject of privacy, but the aspect of privacy from my biased perception is almost non-existent. It's something that I learned and I thought, and in the police academy we learned all the proper rules of criminal procedure, etc., and interrogation, and a little bit about surveillance. And then when you hit the street, the first words out of the old-timer's mouth is, forget all that crap they told me in the academy. Pay attention, we'll show you how the real world works. And we learned how the real world works, and from what I gather, he knows exactly what I'm talking about. It was probably part of the real world that was working.
yeah.
Well, could I just make a comment on that? When we were doing this, there was one investigation. We worked with 2 FBI agents in New York. The most honest men, hardworking law enforcement I ever met. And we did an investigation working with Lieutenant Gary McGaughy of the Minneapolis Police Department, Kenny Tidwell, and police officers from Columbus, Ohio. We were picked 12 of the biggest pimps in the United States. We convicted 11 of them. The 12th one we never found. So I think he was killed, but we convicted 11 of the 12. Here's the thing that happened. Every police officer, the 2 FBI agents were transferred out. To this day, any police officer, and I will challenge anybody that wants to challenge me on it, you do an investigation other than the street level hookers, and you get into the upper level like we did going after the biggest pimps, your career is over. And I don't care what agency you are with. And I have the names to back it up, and some of it is as current as of 3 years ago. So that's what my comment is. And the FBI has a lot of agents that would do the job if they were allowed to. Again, we get back to when are the people going to stand up and make them do what they're supposed to do? And Herb is 100% right, because I know the files that were held by Lieutenant Gary McGaughy and Kenny Tidwell. And about a year ago, I asked for a copy of them. And strangely, there are no copies.
How odd.
So why don't somebody ask to find out where they are?
Very, very interesting. We touched on this very briefly yesterday when we talked. You said something, and I don't want to quote you, but it gave me to believe that central Minnesota is as hotter than we might think in terms of police surveillance and concern about crime in this part of the state.
Well, what my thing goes back is when we first started, this July will be 50 years ago that I saw the first girl from Stearns County being prostituted in Times Square. And I've been working on this ever since. And just a couple of years ago, we had a task force. And as Herb said, how many prosecutions have you seen? The Stearns County Attorney Janelle Kendall confirmed at the last Stearns County Municipal League meeting that they had convicted one person. As far as I know, that's the only conviction they've ever had on a pimping case out here. And that's why, again, it's not the cops. I told the sheriff of Stearns County, first of all, you need money and you need men to do this kind of work. And the same goes for Morrison County, all the counties concerned. You gotta have money, you gotta have men, and then second of all, you gotta protect the cops. They have to, I don't care if they're police officers, FBI agents, they must be protected. The city of St. Martin passed a resolution that incorporates all those laws. The number one law in it is that if anybody interferes with a police officer working human trafficking, he's guilty of a felony. That includes the boss, the mayor, or anybody else. And these laws must be passed to protect the cops. And I have the rest of the resolution. If anybody wants, call the show and they'll give you a copy of it.
Jim, I forgot to mention this, I think, is the current mayor of St. Martin, Minnesota. Beautiful little town. So he knows what he's talking about, and he's been a big part of making some changes there that he felt were really necessary. Herb, what has your experience been? When you were in St. Paul, working as a police officer, was there any kind of a connection? I'm asking this because there's a lot of drugs in Rothstein, a certain amount of prostitution, and the drugs that are here are the big heavy hitters, heroin and methamphetamine. And I know this is going back some time, but were there concerns even then about mid-Minnesota?
I would say no, that the reality is that prohibition has not worked. Everybody knows that. The quality of the drugs goes up, the availability of the drugs goes up, and the price goes down. The more drug task force we have, the more emphasis we put on drugs. It's almost counterproductive. And obviously, I'm an advocate for decriminalization and regulation. It's crazy.
Yes, so am I. How do you think about that, Jim? Do you think there should be decriminalization and regulation of?
Well, you cannot use laws to enforce morality or social
That's
norms. So let's start with that. But as far as the drug business goes, there's far more to the drug business than meets the eye. It is controlled. We, in our investigations, again using human compromise, we got the levels of the highest deals, and we talked about wars. How many wars have been fought under the guise of all these different things, terrorists and everything else, when it's nothing more? Who's controlling the drug marketing, the shipping lanes, the Baca Valley and such? And then if you look at it, you can't move drugs in this country or in this world unless you've got permission. So you put that in your hat and start looking, and just go up to some of our seaports and find out what's coming in, which was part of the investigation that Lieutenant Gary McGaughy did in Minneapolis. And that was in the end of about 1977. The documentation he had has not stopped since that day. So if you find that, you'll know what's going on.
So he was investigating drug trafficking into and out of Minnesota from where?
Oh, from all over the world,
From all over?
especially South America at that time,
Okay.
when it was the cocaine market. So, yeah, but the heroin and stuff was coming into.
Yeah. I'm with her about it. It seems to me that the only way to stop the drug problem is to stop defining it as a problem and just look at it as a reality. There are people who are addicted. There are people who want to use recreational drugs. If we legalize it and we can control it, I think that would be a better approach. So this is a naive point of view. I don't have all the background these gentlemen have, but just throw that in there for free. What brought you to St. Martin?
Well, I was born and raised in St. Martin, and then the military got me involved, and I actually went back to New York and ended up taking the police department test. And the only reason I came back was my mom and dad got sick, and I was the oldest, so I took care of them until they died. I had to be somewhere, so here I am. Otherwise, I wouldn't have come back.
You'd stayed in New York?
No, I don't know where I'd have been.
But not here. And, well, you know what? We've run out of time, I just realized. So I want to thank you both for being with us. Always interesting to talk to both of you about your experience with law enforcement, and to get a look at that from your point of view instead of just the civilian point of view. So thank you very much, and we hope we'll have you both back at some point. This is Theresa Skorseth for Can We Talk, thanking you for joining us, and we hope to see you soon.